The foreign minister of the small island nation of Tuvalu made something of a splash at the recent COP26 climate change conference. And I mean literally made a splash, as he symbolised what was happening to his country by giving his talk in the water. The aim was to highlight the plight of those countries most vulnerable to rising sea levels. There's a certain amount of simplified nonsense that gets talked on the subject, and there are some interesting dilemmas and grey areas. That, of course, is catnip for this channel, so let's take a look. There are 4 countries in particular that are sufficiently low-lying to be already experiencing difficult challenges from rising sea levels. They are the Maldives, the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu and Kiribati. A combined population of 600,000 people, although the vast majority of those are in the Maldives. An average elevation of just 2 metres above sea level, with the Maldives at 1.6 metres, the world's lowest lying country, and they have some real problems that kick in well before the lands become totally inundated, in spite of that stunt by the Tuvalu minister. We are told that a rise in sea level of less than a metre would make their territory more or less uninhabitable, at least without major adaptation measures. People have been talking about the problem for some time, certainly since 2009, when the then Maldives government held a meeting underwater to highlight the issue. And then most recently, just this year, the leaders of all 4 countries raised the issue of the threat to their states at the UN General Assembly. Unfortunately, the discussion of this has been somewhat dumbed down by the state of what counts for discussion in the climate space. Some campaigners dramatise the situations beyond what is helpful, and then you get a raft of sceptics presenting straw men based on 1 or 2 non-scientific sources from the past, pretending that scientists predicted that the Maldives would be underwater by now, when they actually did no such thing. Invariably, these come from 2 articles, one quoting a government minister and another that is often represented as saying that the Maldives would sink by 2030 when it actually doesn't say that. For the avoidance of doubt, no scientific studies have said that the Maldives would be underwater by now. And then, having framed this straw man, they point out that people aren't behaving as though their straw man is real. So they ask, if people are expecting them to be underwater within 10 years, then why are they building new airports and holiday hotels, etc, etc, etc? Add that to the out-and-out wackos who just lie. So this commenter, playing the "I've spoken to locals and they confirm it's a scam" card. I have just come back from the Maldives. I was talking to locals about this issue. They all said it is fake news just to bring more tourists before islands disappear. Of course you were. Unverified claims of first-hand discussions or experience, a frequent feature of YouTube comment sections. So alright, let's not spend more time on that. Let's just look at the detail for 2 out of the 4. Maybe the largest and the smallest, for their situations and their prospects are quite different. So let's start with the Maldives. The Maldives may be one country, but it's split over around 1,200 separate islands. It's projected that 80% of those islands could be uninhabitable around a 30-year timescale, and this isn't because they'll be inundated in that time, but predominantly because of the encroachment of salt water into the former freshwater aquifers. The Minister for Economic Development, Mohammed Saeed, was quoted saying this in an article by Euromoney. For most of our people, the lack of drinking water has become a permanent issue. Not long ago, the country's atolls would catch and store rain in the summer, eking out their reserves through the dry winter months. But the rain no longer falls reliably, and rising sea levels mean saline water intruding into the water table. That's why we're now forced to ship water from Malé to more than 100 outlying islands. Not all of those small atoll islands are sinking, although some of them certainly are. Small atoll islands can grow, not sink, as the sea levels rise. But that process doesn't necessarily prevent the contamination of fresh water with salt water, and it depends on the health of the coral polyps on which they're based. So where the corals are not healthy, then those islands will not grow. And where they're currently healthy, you're dependent on that not changing, with issues such as warming or ocean acidification or de-alkalization, I suppose you could more accurately describing it, which may impact on their health. And part of it also comes down to money. So the bigger islands that are principal holiday resort islands, well, they make plenty of money, and they are the first, therefore, to have sea defences put in place, enabling the facile to take photos of the idyllic beach on that island and pretend that that alone proves something. But of course, the smaller islands, largely populated with the less well-off populations, those do not do so well in the cost-benefit equation of how much to spend defending them versus allowing them to go. It's quite interesting to review the history of the government's attitude on all this. The previous president, Mohammed Nasheed, who now has become something of a climate campaigner superstar, he pushed the climate situation hard on the world stage as an area of major focus, hence the stunt with the underwater cabinet meeting. He pitched for climate money from the UN to be able to build defensive infrastructure in the face of rising sea levels. And, you'd probably agree that it's surely one of those things you would want to use that sort of fund to support. I mean, consider this, more than half of the national budget of the Maldives is reportedly spent on climate change adaptation measures. The problem? Climate funding from big bureaucratic organisations is onerous to bid for, slow to arrive, and it's also the target of a huge amount of competition. Now, Nasheed's presidency was relatively short-lived. The successor president, Abdullah Yameen, took something of a different approach. He targeted economic growth and development over specifically sustainability-themed activity. At the start of his presidency, he promised to double per capita income and to create 200,000 new jobs, and this meant pushing tourism, which included building a new airport runway and seaplane terminal, land reclamation and construction on Hulumani Island, an artificial island being built up by pumping sand from the sea floor. And you can add to that the construction of the futuristic floating city to be set in a lagoon close to the capital Malé. This process has meant billions of dollars of new capital flowing through the country, and that has enabled it to spend more on needed adaptation and infrastructure than chasing climate money was ever delivering. By the way, some might argue that if the Maldives is pushing for the world to take climate change so seriously, why is it investing in airports and etc.? Isn't that hypocrisy? Well, in a rational world, no, it isn't. An economically vibrant Maldives will add an utterly inconsequential amount to the world's emissions, but it is essential for it to be able to adapt to its changing situation. Personally, I think it's a metaphor for how we should approach this dynamic overall. A thriving, successful society will do much better at innovating, replacing technologies and adapting than a hair shirt society. You don't have to go all the way with me on that principle to recognise that these tiny island states should be able to do whatever's going to work for them. Besides, it's not mutually exclusive. The Maldives has said that with financial support from international partners, it will aim to become net zero by 2030. And it will be the first beneficiary of a new fund for sustainable energy solutions that was launched at the COP26 conference this year. None of that is a get-out-of-jail-free card. A lot of those islands are suffering real problems, and the difficulties facing the population are considerable. Out of the nearly 1,200 islands, 90% have seen flooding, 97% are seeing shoreline erosion, 64% of which are seeing serious levels of erosion. The scientific research suggests that drinking water may be all contaminated by seawater sometime between 2030 and 2065. Storm surges would massively flood the islands between 2060 and the end of the century. The Maldives sinks below the waves event, so beloved of the people who write headlines or the sneering responses to them, finally potentially kicks in the half century after 2100. If climate change is held to below 2 degrees, and that plays out medium term in sea level rise, then the Maldives perhaps scrapes through. Changed significantly in the process, but still very much in existence. If sea level rise follows one of the more aggressive growth pathways, then even that may become impossible to maintain, especially if the health of the corals is compromised. And you also have to make sure that all that wealth generation is well managed and economically sustainable. Some international financial institutions have warned that the Maldives is facing a high risk of debt problems due to easy Chinese lending for infrastructure. Some of that development has come as a result of being part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and that's not something that comes without strings attached. Which was one reason why President Yamin was defeated in the 2018 election by an opponent who promised to pull back from Chinese influence and turn instead towards India. And you have to ensure that in pursuing the development, you don't actually damage the natural systems that currently are doing their best to adapt to change. Some of the infrastructure development has been suggested as pushing the islands to a tipping point, where the disturbance caused to coral reefs can actually undermine its capacity to respond to sea levels. So that's the biggest and wealthiest in relative terms of the so-called drowning nations. What about Tuvalu? To start with, you could hardly conceive of a more different starting point. Tuvalu has just 12,000 residents and it has next to no tourism. Go onto YouTube and search on Tuvalu. You'll find one or two YouTube travel channels that went there having looked for the least visited countries on Earth.
How did I find Tuvalu?
Yeah.
I googled what's the least visited country in the world, and then I found Tuvalu, and so I was like, oh, I have to go and see it. I've been on this island for about 4 hours now, and I still haven't seen a single other tourist.
One look at Tuvalu and you kind of get the headline message as to why the country's so vulnerable to rising sea levels. I mean, there is just about nowhere on the island where you can't see the ocean on both sides of you wherever you are. The highest elevation is 4.6 metres, which gives Tuvalu the second lowest maximum elevation of any country after the Maldives. But those highest parts are generally in narrow storm dunes on the ocean side of the islands, which are sometimes topped by tropical cyclones. So in 2015, Cyclone Pam saw waves of up to 5 metres breaking over the outer islands and causing damage and contaminating freshwater sources. Right now, gradual sea level rise allows for coral polyp activity to raise the atolls along with the sea level. But again, if it goes at a faster rate or if the corals are damaged, then that will quickly fail there as well. As of a 2010 study by Arthur Webb and Paul Kench, Tuvalu is one of 23 Pacific atolls out of a total of 27 that is either stable or growing in size. A later study by Kench et al. Detailed that in the 4 decades to 2014, Tuvalu's total land area grew by 73 hectares, or 2.9%. Within that average, it's worth noting that some of the smaller, generally uninhabited islands, 27% of the total, have shrunk. Again, the health of the corals is key. Coral reefs are dynamic systems, with the action of waves and storms either eroding them or by depositing sand and gravel, expanding them. And they can change position on their reef islands, which is a challenge. I mean, how do you live on an island that starts to move around you? One of the islands in Tuvalu's main atoll has shifted more than 350 feet in over 40 years, for instance. Some of those factors don't get shared with the most developed parts of the island, such as the capitals. Their structures, seawalls, roads and infrastructure are of course locked in place. And the island growth of surface area doesn't stop the problems we've already heard about: saline intrusion, storm surges and coastal erosion. One of the authors of the 2 studies said that people who had simplistically jumped on the research to claim that there was no problem for the islands from climate change were resisting a more nuanced understanding of what was actually happening. One side holds that the islands are sinking, the other that they're fine and they're going to stay that way. The argument that they're having is not about reality and what it means for the lives of the real people who are facing it. Other factors. The sea level for Tuvalu is very affected by El Niño events, which temporarily drop the sea level for several months. But if you look at averages over time, analysis of 15 years data, which isn't a long time for trends, but that's all the data we've got, suggests an increase in sea level of 5.9 millimetres per year. Tuvalu is also affected by what are called perigean spring tide events, known as a king tide, which raise the sea level higher than a normal high tide. The biggest one of these recorded so far was 3.4 metres high in February 2006 and again in February 2015. Such events all create additional damage and make it harder to recover. Projected sea level rise, which assumes that the rate of rise will increase, could make Tuvalu uninhabitable over the next 100 years. At what point people give up before you reach that is an open question. I mean, you don't wake up one day and everything's fine, and then the very next day the country is uninhabitable. But even if it's not immediately imminent, which it doesn't seem to be, the question is already being discussed. What happens to any of these countries when they reach the point where they do become uninhabitable? What happens to a nation when it has no viable land? This is not a straightforward question. The current premise of international law is that a state can only exist by meeting 4 criteria. 1, it has a defined territory. 2, it has a settled population. 3, it has a system of governance. And 4, it conducts international relations. So what happens to an existing state when it loses its territory? It's not something that has ever happened in the modern era. Tuvalu may only have a population of 12,000, which puts it in the rank of a small English town, but it is a state, with representations at the United Nations and all the rest. So yes, you could accommodate that population elsewhere, probably almost without noticing. But can you do it without losing a state, a country with a culture and a history and all of the rest? Now sure, maybe the Maldives will be successful in holding onto its territory, but with zero tourism and a tiny population, Tuvalu is unlikely to ever achieve the economic dynamism to make that happen. So then you have 3 remaining options. First option, it could buy land in another country to settle its population. For instance, one of the other 4, Kiribati, has bought land in Fiji. But there's a challenge to that, because while the larger country might be willing to sell land, it's not going to cede sovereignty over that land. Australia and New Zealand, for instance, have both rejected such a solution. The second option is that the island state could merge with another state, create a federation or a confederation. While the disappearing state doesn't bring land to that union, it would bring its claim to territorial waters potentially. The legal basis for that, though, is somewhat precarious, and maintaining a claim to waters in the absence of land, it's certain to be challenged by other states. So that option is considered to be unlikely. And then finally you have the options of some sort of move internationally to redefine statehood to permit statehood without land. The Sovereign Order of Malta is often considered as a state without territory, so you could point to that as an example. But that would be to confuse a legal personality, with the Malta example, with a country. Practically speaking, it would just raise too many questions. Where would your landless state be based? How could you maintain the legitimacy of its government? And if you create such landless states, wouldn't you just create a flood of groups jumping on the opportunity to declare themselves a state with a right to representation at the United Nations? So that seems unlikely. You'll have noticed 3 options. None of them seem likely. So right now, in the brutal realpolitik world that we live in, you can imagine the default is going to be that the 12,000, or however many it is by then, people of Tuvalu eventually lose their home and their nation. They become absorbed into another country who takes them in as refugees, and they try for as long as they can to keep the memory alive of their heritage before it is eventually subsumed by their host country. Given the countries that have been conquered through history, the nations that have disappeared, the people that have been slaughtered, you might take it as a minor note of sadness in the overall historical perspective. But if the world doesn't accept that as an outcome, then it's going to have to spend the time working out which of those alternatives it can actually live with. In the meantime, you can expect the countries concerned to force the pace. Tuvalu signed an agreement recently with Antigua and Barbuda looking at the possibility of lawsuits to compel large emitters to pay a price for the destruction in the island states. They don't have easy options, but they're looking at getting an opinion at the International Court of Justice on whether nations can be held responsible for the impact of their emissions on others, or possibly from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. An advisory opinion from either of those wouldn't be binding, but it could be used potentially then as leverage for further legal challenges. The factor that muddies the waters when it comes to looking at options is that for many international climate campaigners, in all the places you find them, including governments, the low-level countries have become iconic and have a predetermined role to play as the victims of climate change. So, for instance, when New Zealand proposed humanitarian visas for climate refugees from such states back in 2017, that plan had to be quickly abandoned because the Pacific Islanders didn't want them. The campaign message might be that the islands are doomed, but people don't give up so easily on their homes. They said governments instead should institute a stepwise approach, reduce emissions, support adaptation efforts, then provide legal migration pathways, and finally, if all else fails, then grant refugee status. You might describe that as the path of preference for slowing the consequences of victimhood. The Maldives has perhaps shown that agreeing to play the role of victim isn't necessarily the most effective approach, even if you can't do the opposite in the way that they did it exactly. The peer-reviewed study that showed that increase in island area by Kench et al. Hinted as much, and it said this: results challenge perceptions of island loss, showing islands are dynamic features that will persist as sites for habitation over the next century, presenting alternate opportunities for adaptation that embrace the heterogeneity of island types and their dynamics. In other words, the fact that the island is not going to be inundated, although it will have huge challenges with water contamination, storm surges and the like, it might be tackling that would involve a different mindset and approach to the managed victimhood narrative. Of course, it's easy to sit comfortably on the sidelines and suggest such a thing. Again, though, the Maldives came to their conclusion on their own initiative, and the victimhood narrative is just as much an external creation as anything else. Now, of course, there are low-lying countries that are not based on coral atolls, and they face all sorts of problems from sea level rise. Nevertheless, perhaps in the short term, it's time to shift the mindset away from the inevitability of demise to actually taking on the significant challenges there will be in keeping these places habitable and welcoming for their human occupants. The challenge in the short term is that, like the polar bear, they have become iconic in a way that prevents people from discussing them rationally with a view to solving the problems. Now, of course, some people argue that this is all irrelevant if the sea levels are not actually going to accelerate in the rate of rise, which is what they contend. I did a video a while ago looking in detail at what we know about the science of sea level rise. You might want to check that one out next.